the third speaker, Professor Dominique Lambert, who for personal reasons is unable to join us. So we thank Father Prem, who will make the presentation on his behalf and read for us the text that he sent us. Professor Dominique Lambert, to present him very briefly, he is brilliantly prepared. I mean, he's got a PhD in physics and a PhD in philosophy. He is an authority on Lemaitre, Georges Lemaitre, the Monsignor, the priest, who was the president of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, who proposed the Big Bang Theory. So we have in the person of Dominique Lambert, one who knows astronomy, but one who also knows about ecology. So I pass on to Father Prem, who has generously accepted to make the presentation on behalf of Professor Dominique Lambert. Father Prem, over to you.
So I am reading on behalf of Dominique Lambert what he has sent in the paper. Can you hear me, Josh?
Yeah, we can. Thank you, Father Prem. Yeah, thank you.
My aim is to emphasize some crucial and really original points of the third chapter of Laudato Si, entitled The Human Roots of the Ecological Crisis. First, the work of scientific and technological developments. It is worth first noting that this document is not at all struggling against new technologies. Like art, technosciences are related to creative powers left by God to human beings. Laudato Si number 102 says, science and technology are wonderful products of a God-given human creativity. Technosciences are also very important because they improve the quality of human life. The modification of nature for useful purposes has distinguished the human family from the beginning. Technology itself expresses the inner tension that impels man gradually to overcome material limitations. Technology has remedied countless evils which used to harm and limit human beings. At the end of the chapter, the Pope comes back to these aspects in relation with new biotechnologies. It is very important to note that Laudato Si emphasizes the fact that human creativity at stake in sciences have not to be avoided or rejected because they cannot be suppressed. This is a crucial point because the Church is very often reproached for its alleged opposition to the mainstream of scientific researches. Here precisely, the Pope takes into account the fact that scientific and technological evolutions have not to be stopped. Here we have a recognition of the philosophical and theological importance of the technological evolution. If an artist cannot be stopped from using his or her creativity, neither should those who possess particular gifts for the advancement of science and technology be prevented from using their God-given talents for the services of others. The last words are, of course, very important. The creativity powers which cannot be suppressed are to be oriented for the service of others, and in a way that respects completely human dignity. In our society, the fear of sciences and technosciences has led some believers to reject science as such. Anti-science movements are not encouraged by Laudato Si. Nobody is suggesting to come back to the Stone Age, said the text number 114. What is proposed, on the contrary, is a way to develop science and possibly to perform interventions on nature, always in a direction homogeneous with the recreation as intended by God, respecting animal and human dignity and aiming at the common good. Thus, we have to accept science and technology as a gift of God. To refuse technoscience would be to renounce to an important gift and simply to renounce to our humanity. But of course, we have first to understand what science really is and where are its own limits. An epistemological analysis is thus very important. Second, epistemological remarks. What is science and what are its limits? First point, scientific methodological reductionism. I think this is a very important part of the chapter we are referring to. The successes of science are based on a method which studies and reduces each reality often isolated in a lab as a pure object which can be manipulated and analyzed and also transformed from outside. These successes and the globalization of the applications of technologies, building a dominant and prevailing technocratic paradigm, tend to make people to believe that science and its reductionist method is, on the one hand, the only way to understand reality, and on the other hand, that such a method is in fact objective. But this conception is not true, and it is important to reintroduce a critical approach. Techno-scientific approach is not the only way to discover and exhibit all the rich dimensions of the world. Poetry, philosophy, religious traditions are also legitimate pathways to contemplate and understand the human life and the cosmos as a whole. These pathways to truth refuse to reduce reality to a pure object left under the powers of the experts. If we consider that science is only way to get truth, then we are leading to accept that every reality, every human being, and the natural environment are pure objects waiting to be dissected and exploited by analytical methods. And this is one of the roots of the ecological crisis we are now experiencing. This root is thus grounded on a false epistemological assumption. Second, science and technologies are not neutral. Furthermore, technosciences are not at all completely neutral. Neutral means that technosciences would not be varying of any human values and intentions. Laudato Si says, science and technology are not neutral. From the beginning to the end of a process, various intentions and possibilities are in play and can take distinct shapes. This is a statement that we can find in some studies dating back to the 70s. At this time, philosophers of science showed by historical and case studies that sciences and technologies are very open-shaped, even if one is not conscious of that fact by human, economical, or political intentions. Nuclear physics, outer space exploration, or biotechnologies are not motivated exclusively by pure speculation. They are guided and motivated by economic and political projects. Science, as you said above, is not the only way to search the truth, but there is something more. It is not completely independent of non-purely scientific ideas. It is important to be conscious of that and to make a critical approach of some aims, enhancing scientific projects which are only motivated by maximizing the profit or the power of certain groups or nations. As the encyclical says, we have to accept that technological products are not neutral, for they create a framework which ends up conditioning lifestyles and shaping social possibilities along the lines dictated by the interests of certain powerful groups. Decisions which may seem purely instrumental are in reality decisions about the kind of society we want to build. Laudato Si, 107. To present technoscience as neutral, for example, saying the outer space researches are only of the ways to discover truth about exoplanets, is to allow to hide other stakes, for example, political, military, financial, commercial stakes. For example, exploitation of outer space resources to increase the profit of private companies, to increase military supremacy, etc. I consider that one of the original aspects of Laudato Si is precisely to use this epistemological study referring to social, political, and ideological readings of the techno-scientific phenomenon in order to detect what is very often at stake in the real and concrete techno-scientific process. These studies show the hidden and implicit assumptions that build what Thomas Kuhn called the scientific paradigm. This set of assumptions which shapes and orients us implicitly the history of science, these assumptions being very often not scientific ones. Third, the consequences of a mistaken epistemology. The mistaken epistemology, presenting science firstly as the only path to truth, using a reductionist method, considering realities, including human being as a pure, insensate object, leads naturally to a mistaken and misguided anthropology. Embryo, disabled persons are considered only in function of these usefulness or unusefulness with respect to human decisions and projects. Secondly, the mistaken epistemology presenting as completely neutral with regard to social, economic, and political intentions prevents us to discover the real aims of some techno-scientific project. Therefore, as a matter of example, this attitude has the following consequence. The outer space, the ocean floor, Antarctica, etc., are considered only as fields left open for the free and unlimited commercial exploitation. A false conception of science and its limits constitute important roots of ecological and anthropological crisis. A paradox. The omnipotence of human being which considers himself simply as an object. Human being disconnected to his or her environment becomes the center of the world. This is a paradox underlined by Laudato Si. Technocratic paradigm denies any value and importance to human being considered as a pure object. But on the other side, this paradigm is based on a conception giving to human being unlimited powers and assuming that human person is the only source of the truth and of ethical values. The myth of unlimited human power goes hands to hands with a conception which deletes completely the dignity of human person. Let us note that this is a feature also of all the contemporary totalitarianism as described by Hannah Arendt, for example. The neglect of human dignity appears clearly in the process of replacing human beings by machines based only on financial considerations and depriving them of their jobs. Mathematical parameters and models, algorithms cannot take into account the meaning of a job and its importance for an individual as well as for the common good of a society based on relationship of trust and fraternity. Employment is not at all only a problem that could be tackled by one and only one scientific technical field. This conception is totally incoherent and self-defeating. Laudato Si calls for a more coherent view respecting the dignity of human being and view of the fact that everything is interconnected. Of course, respecting the natural environment as a whole. What is important here is to come back to objective truths and universal principles in order to avoid the practical relativism granting to individuals and to oppressive and dominant groups the powers to decide what the truth is. We find back here a deep traditional teaching of Christian philosophy. There is a deep human nature which does not depend on the decisions of some individuals, groups, or nations, and that has to be respected as such. This comes back to human nature is not at all arbitrary, artificial, because it is the way to prevent from being trapped in the above-mentioned antinomy. Conclusion. Let us summarize this chapter. We have not to renounce scientific creativity, but according to a deep epistemological perspective, we have to detect and to be conscious of the hidden or implicit goals enhancing alleged pure scientific projects in order also to assess their effects on society, on individuals, on family, and on environment, but also to prevent scientific projects from being considered only to serve interests of a group in contradiction of the common good. To orient the development of the technoscience, because it is not possible to stop it, we need an anthropological perspective. And the latter has to be rooted in universal values and on objective truths, as well as on theological perspective open to God, preventing us from closing our universe and our systems of ideas on themselves, because deep and complete reality are more than ideas, as the Pope often said. The roots of the ecological crisis are thus related to two main, very often underestimated or forgotten factors. First, a first root happens to be a mistaken representation of what technoscience really is. It is a non-neutral, human-shaped enterprise bearing some ideological assumptions related to interests. This hides very often the real motivations of some technological development. And this is dangerous for humans and for the environment. This epistemological representation is related to another mistaken conception, considering science as the only rigorous knowledge. This undimensional vision implies the idea that every ecological issue has only a scientific answers and solution. This vision is what we call today the ideology of the expertise. We know that ecological crisis implies also political decisions and philosophical and religious attitudes in front of the nation. The solutions of the ecological crisis depend also on conceptions, on human being, and on courageous political decision aiming the common good. Second main root of the ecological crisis. This crisis is also related to a pragmatical relativism, including the rejection of the notion of the objective truth and of fundamental ethical principles such as the human nature and dignity, leading to exploitations without any limit of the environment and of human beings. These two factors lead to a situation where the citizens, namely someone like you and me, who is not an expert, has not allowed to criticize techno-scientific projects presenting themselves as objective, pure, nor allowed to identify the real aims hidden behind the projects. The loss of objective truth leads also to myths like the infinite growth in economy or the alleged infinite plasticity of the natural reality, which would be able to undergo all our manipulations. Reading this interesting chapter of Laudato Si, we are thus invited to come back to a new and broad epistemological approach of technosciences, taking into account the hidden assumptions of their paradigms and to promote an ethics based on fundamental principles, protecting the human dignity of human beings, considered as beings interconnected to one another and to the natural environment, and open to God who gives us the being and the life. Because without transcendence, all our projects to solve ecological and climate crisis would run the risk to be as physical into the closure of a priori ideologies. Everything is interconnected, but also everything exists. From particles to galaxies and to human beings, thanks to God Creator. Thanks, Dominique Lambert, and thank you all for your attention.